The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Windsor Castle, casting long shadows across the ornate carpets. George walked slowly down the corridor, his small feet making soft sounds on the polished marble floor. At just 10 years old, he carried himself with the dignity expected of a future king, but today something felt different. The usual warmth that filled these halls seemed absent, replaced by an uncomfortable tension that even a child could sense. George had noticed the changes over the past few weeks. His father, William, spent more time locked away in his study, emerging only for official duties with a forced smile that never quite reached his eyes. His mother, Kate, had been away more frequently, citing various royal engagements and charitable obligations. But it was his step-grandmother Camilla who seemed to hover around every corner, her presence more pronounced than ever before. The young prince made his way to the breakfast room, where he expected to find his usual morning routine. Instead, he discovered Camilla sitting at the head of the table, sipping tea from his mother's favorite china cup. The sight stopped him in the doorway, confusion flickering across his young features. "Good morning, George," Camilla said, her voice carrying a tone that seemed both sweet and sharp at the same time. "Come, sit down. We need to have a conversation." George approached cautiously, taking his usual seat but keeping his eyes on his step-grandmother. Something about her demeanor made him uncomfortable, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. The servants who normally bustled about preparing breakfast were notably absent, leaving the two of them alone in the vast dining room. "Where is everyone?" George asked, his voice small but clear. "Where's Mummy and Papa?" Camilla set down her teacup with deliberate care, the small clink against the saucer seeming unnaturally loud in the quiet room. "Your father is attending to important matters of state, and your mother." She paused, as if choosing her words carefully. "Your mother is where she needs to be." The cryptic answer only deepened George's confusion. He had learned from an early age to read the subtle cues that adults often thought children missed, and something in Camilla's manner set off alarm bells in his young mind. The way she avoided direct eye contact, the slight tension in her shoulders, the careful modulation of her voice, it all suggested that something significant was happening, something that involved him but which he wasn't being told about directly. "I want to see Mummy," George said, his voice taking on a firmness that surprised even himself. "When will she be back?" Camilla's smile faltered for just a moment before reasserting itself. "George, dear, sometimes in life we must accept changes that we don't necessarily understand. Your mother has made certain choices. Choices that affect all of us." The young prince felt a chill run down his spine. The way Camilla spoke about his mother, with that subtle edge of disapproval, made him want to defend Kate even though he didn't fully understand what he was defending her against. He had inherited his father's protective instincts and his mother's intuitive nature, and both were telling him that this conversation was heading somewhere he didn't want to go. "What kind of choices?" George pressed, his young voice growing stronger. "What are you talking about?" Camilla leaned back in her chair, studying the boy with eyes that seemed to assess and calculate. For a moment, George glimpsed something behind her carefully constructed facade, a hardness that made him think of winter mornings when the castle felt more like a prison than a home. "Your mother has decided that her priorities lie elsewhere," Camilla said finally. "She has been spending time with people who, well, let's just say they don't have the best interests of the crown at heart. Your father and I have tried to guide her, to help her understand her responsibilities, but she has chosen a different path." George's young mind struggled to process these words. His mother, who had always been his anchor, his source of comfort and laughter, was being described as if she were a stranger. The Kate he knew read him bedtime stories, helped him with his lessons, and always made time for him no matter how busy her schedule became. The woman Camilla was describing bore no resemblance to the mother he loved. "I don't believe you," George said quietly, but with a conviction that surprised both of them. "Mummy wouldn't leave us. She wouldn't leave me." Camilla's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "George, you're still very young. There are things about adult relationships, about marriage and duty, that you simply cannot understand yet. Your mother has made her choice, and now we must all adapt to the consequences of that choice." The breakfast room suddenly felt smaller, more oppressive. George could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, could feel the weight of words he didn't fully comprehend pressing down on him like a heavy blanket. He thought of the last time he had seen his mother, just 3 days ago. She had seemed distracted, perhaps, but not like someone preparing to abandon her family. "Where is she?" George asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I want to talk to her myself." "That's not possible right now," Camilla replied, her tone becoming more authoritative. Your mother needs time to think about what she really wants. In the meantime, your father and I will take care of you. You'll want for nothing, George. You'll have the best education, the finest tutors, everything befitting a future king. But George didn't want tutors and fine things. He wanted his mother's laugh echoing through the halls, wanted her to ruffle his hair when she thought he'd done well, wanted her to be there when he woke from nightmares about the responsibilities that would someday rest on his shoulders. The promise of material comfort felt hollow compared to the growing ache in his chest. I don't understand, George said, and, for the first time his carefully maintained composure began to crack. Why would Mummy leave? Did I do something wrong? Did Papa do something wrong? Camilla moved around the table, approaching George with what might have been intended as a comforting gesture, but which felt more like a circling predator to the young prince. She placed a hand on his shoulder, and he had to resist the urge to pull away. Sometimes, George, people aren't who we think they are. Your mother came into this family as an outsider, and perhaps she never truly understood what that meant. The weight of duty, the sacrifice required, the putting of country and crown before personal desires, these are concepts that don't come naturally to everyone. Each word felt like a small cut, designed to slowly erode George's faith in his mother while building up Camilla's own position as the voice of reason and stability. But George was sharper than Camilla gave him credit for, and he could sense the manipulation even if he couldn't articulate it clearly. Mummy always put us first, George said stubbornly. She always said family was the most important thing. And yet where is she now? Camilla asked, her voice taking on a false sadness that made George's skin crawl. If family truly was her priority, would she have left you here, confused and hurt, while she pursues her own interests? The question hit George like a physical blow. The doubt that Camilla was trying to plant began to take root despite his best efforts to resist it. Where was his mother? Why hadn't she explained anything to him herself? Why had he been left to learn about whatever was happening from Camilla, of all people? Tears began to form in George's eyes, but he blinked them back fiercely. He had been taught from an early age that future kings don't cry, at least not in public. But the effort to maintain his composure was becoming increasingly difficult as Camilla's words continued to chip away at his certainty. I want to go to my room, George said, his voice thick with suppressed emotion. I want to be alone. Of course, dear, Camilla said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. But, George, remember what we've discussed. Your mother made her choice. Now you must make yours. You can choose to pine for someone who has already moved on, or you can choose to embrace the family that remains committed to you and your future. George didn't respond. He simply turned and walked out of the breakfast room, his small figure maintaining its dignity even as his world crumbled around him. But Camilla's voice followed him into the corridor. Think carefully, George. Your father needs your support now more than ever. Don't let him down the way your mother has. As George climbed the stairs to his room, each step felt heavier than the last. The portraits of his ancestors that lined the walls seemed to watch him with disapproving eyes, as if they too believed that his mother had somehow failed in her duty. The weight of expectation that he had always carried as the heir to the throne now felt crushing, made worse by the suggestion that he might be forced to choose between his parents. He reached his room and closed the door behind him, finally, allowing the tears to fall. But, even as he cried, a part of his mind was working, trying to piece together the fragments of information he had been given. Something about Camilla's story didn't ring true. His mother's last words to him had been about looking forward to a special family trip they had planned. She had seemed excited, not like someone preparing to abandon her family. George walked to his window and looked out over the castle grounds. Somewhere out there was the truth about what had really happened to his mother. And, despite his youth, despite the fear and confusion that threatened to overwhelm him, George made a silent promise to himself that he would find that truth, no matter what it cost him. The morning sun continued to shine through his window, but, for George, the world had grown considerably darker. In the space of one breakfast conversation, his childhood had been forever altered, and the innocence that should have protected him for a few more years had been stripped away by an adult's ambition and cruelty. As he sat on his bed, clutching a photograph of his family taken just months earlier, George couldn't know that his mother was at that very moment fighting her own battle to return to him. He couldn't know that the story Camilla had told him was carefully constructed to serve her own purposes. All he knew was that his world had changed, and nothing would ever be the same again. The castle around him continued its ancient routines, servants moving through corridors, guards changing shifts, the machinery of monarchy grinding on as it had for centuries. But, in one small room, a young prince grieved for the loss of his mother and struggled to understand how love could be so easily dismissed as weakness, how duty could be used as a weapon against the very people it was supposed to protect. The first seeds of doubt had been planted, but they had not fallen on fertile ground. George's love for his mother ran too deep, his understanding of her character too complete, for Camilla's poison to take root without a fight. The battle for the young prince's heart and mind had begun, and, though he was only 10 years old, George was already preparing to fight back in the only way he knew how, by holding on to the truth of who his mother really was, no matter what anyone else tried to tell him. 3 days had passed since George's devastating conversation with Camilla, and the young prince had barely left his room. He sat by his window each morning, watching the servants go about their duties in the courtyard below, hoping to catch a glimpse of his mother returning. But each day brought only disappointment and growing desperation. William had tried to visit his son twice, but both attempts had ended in awkward silences. The Duke of Cambridge seemed like a shadow of himself, moving through the castle with mechanical precision but none of his usual warmth. When George had asked him directly about Kate's whereabouts, William's face had crumpled momentarily before he composed himself and mumbled something about complicated adult matters that George wouldn't understand. On this particular afternoon, George made a decision that would have been unthinkable just a week earlier. He was going to find answers for himself. If the adults in his life were determined to keep him in the dark, then he would create his own light. He had spent years learning the hidden passages and forgotten corners of the castle, knowledge that had served him well in games of hide and seek with Charlotte and Louis. Now, that same knowledge would serve a more serious purpose. George waited until the castle settled into its afternoon routine. Camilla had taken to holding court in the Queen Consort's sitting room, entertaining visitors and conducting what she called necessary business. William was in meetings with his private secretary and various palace officials. The timing was perfect for a young prince to slip through the shadows unnoticed. The first stop was his parents' private study, a room he had always associated with quiet conversations and family planning. As he approached the door, George could hear Camilla's voice from within, speaking in urgent, hushed tones to someone he couldn't identify. "The boy is more stubborn than I anticipated," Camilla was saying. "He refuses to accept the situation. William is too weak to handle this properly, and Kate's influence over the child runs deeper than we thought." George pressed himself against the wall beside the door, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure it would give him away. The voice that responded was unfamiliar, crisp and professional in a way that suggested someone from outside the family circle. "Perhaps we underestimated the strength of the maternal bond," the stranger replied. "Children that age are often more perceptive than adults give them credit for. If the boy continues to resist, he could become a problem down the line." "He's 10 years old," Camilla said dismissively. "Children adapt. They forget. Give it time, and he'll accept the new reality. Especially once Kate is completely out of the picture." The casual cruelty in her voice made George feel sick. The way she spoke about his mother, as if Kate were an obstacle to be removed rather than a person with her own rights and feelings, revealed a coldness that George had only glimpsed before. But it was the phrase "completely out of the picture" that sent ice through his veins. "And what about the legal complications?" the stranger asked. "The custody arrangements, the public relations aspect? This isn't a private family matter anymore. There are constitutional implications." Camilla's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Let me worry about the constitutional implications. I've been navigating these waters far longer than Kate ever has. She may have the public sympathy now, but that can be managed. Public opinion is remarkably malleable when properly directed." George had to grip the wall to keep from trembling. The conversation he was overhearing painted a picture so different from the version of events he had been given that it felt like discovering he had been living in an elaborate lie. His mother wasn't the one who had abandoned her family, she was being pushed out, systematically isolated and removed from their lives. "The key is patience," Camilla continued. "William is already questioning his judgment, already wondering if Kate really is the right fit for royal life. A few more carefully planted doubts, a few more instances where her unreliability becomes apparent, and he'll start to see things more clearly." "And the boy?" "George will fall in line once he realizes his mother isn't coming back. Children are resilient. He'll attach to whoever provides stability and guidance. Better that it be someone who truly understands what the monarchy requires. George had heard enough. He slipped away from the door, his mind reeling with the implications of what he had just learned. The innocent questions about his mother's whereabouts now took on a sinister cast. Camilla wasn't just delivering bad news, she was actively orchestrating the separation of his family. But where was his mother? If she wasn't the one who had chosen to leave, then where had she gone? George needed more information, and he knew exactly where to find it. His mother's lady-in-waiting, Sarah, had always been kind to him and had seemed genuinely distressed by Kate's sudden absence. If anyone would know the truth, it would be her. Finding Sarah proved easier than expected. She was in Kate's private office, carefully packing personal items into boxes with tears streaming down her face. The sight of her obvious grief confirmed George's growing suspicions about the true nature of his mother's departure. "Sarah?" George said softly, not wanting to startle her. The woman looked up, quickly wiping her eyes and attempting a smile that fooled no one. "Your Highness, you shouldn't be here. This room it's being prepared for renovation." "That's not true, is it?" George asked, his voice carrying a maturity that seemed to surprise Sarah. "Mummy isn't coming back, is she?" "But not because she chose to leave." Sarah's composure crumbled entirely. She sank into a chair, looking at the young prince with a mixture of admiration and despair. "You're too young to understand these things, George. Too young to be burdened with adult problems." "I'm not too young to know when people are lying to me," George replied firmly. "I'm not too young to know that something terrible has happened to my mother. Please, Sarah. Everyone else treats me like I'm stupid, but you never have. Tell me the truth." The plea in his voice seemed to break through Sarah's professional reserve. She looked at the boy for a long moment, seeing not just a child but a young person who deserved honesty in a world that seemed determined to feed him lies. "Your mother fought for you," Sarah said quietly. "She fought harder than anyone should have to fight for the right to be with her own children. But there are forces in this family, people with influence and power, who decided that she wasn't suitable anymore." "Camilla," George said, and it wasn't a question. Sarah nodded reluctantly. "Your step-grandmother has been working behind the scenes for months, undermining your mother's position, questioning her judgment, making it seem like she's unfit for royal duties. Every small mistake was magnified, every moment of independence was painted as rebellion." The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place in George's mind. The increased criticism of his mother in the press, the way certain royal engagements had been reassigned at the last minute, the subtle changes in how palace staff interacted with Kate, it all made sense now as part of a larger campaign to isolate her. "But where is she now?" George asked, his voice breaking slightly. "Why doesn't she come back and fight?" "She's staying with her parents," Sarah admitted. "She was given an ultimatum, George. Comply with certain demands about how she would conduct herself, what causes she could support, how she would raise you and your siblings, or face a very public and very messy separation that would damage not just her but the entire royal family." The cruel efficiency of it took George's breath away. His mother had been maneuvered into an impossible position, forced to choose between surrendering her autonomy or facing consequences that would hurt the very people she was trying to protect. "She chose to protect us," George realized. "She left to protect us from scandal." "She's trying to find another way," Sarah said hastily. "She hasn't given up, George. But the people working against her have resources and influence that make fighting back incredibly difficult. They've made it seem like she's unstable, unreliable, a bad influence on the children." The injustice of it made George feel like screaming. His mother, who had never been anything but loving and dedicated to her family, was being painted as the villain in her own story. Meanwhile, Camilla, who had manipulated and lied from the very beginning, was positioning herself as the voice of reason and stability. "Can I see her?" George asked desperately. "Can I talk to her?" Sarah's face filled with sympathy and regret. "I'm sorry, Your Highness. The separation agreement specifically forbids unsupervised contact. Any communication has to be approved and monitored. They're watching everything." The full weight of his helplessness crashed down on George. He was trapped in a castle that suddenly felt more like a prison, surrounded by people who claimed to love him while systematically destroying his family. His father, whether through weakness or genuine confusion, had been manipulated into allowing this to happen. His mother was being kept from him through legal machinations he was too young to understand but old enough to recognize as deeply wrong. "What can I do?" George asked, and the question came out as barely more than a whisper. Sarah reached out and took his hands, her own trembling slightly. "Be strong, Your Highness. Remember who your mother really is, not what others try to tell you she is. And, when you're older, when you have more power and understanding, fight for the truth. Your mother loves you more than her own life. Never doubt that, no matter what anyone tells you." George nodded, tears finally spilling over despite his efforts to maintain control. The conversation with Sarah had given him answers, but those answers came with a pain deeper than the confusion he had felt before. At least when he hadn't known the truth, he could hope that his mother would simply walk back through the castle doors one day. Now he understood that her return would require a battle against forces much more powerful than a 10-year-old boy could hope to defeat. As he made his way back to his room, George's grief began to transform into something harder and more determined. He couldn't fight Camilla directly, not yet. But he could remember. He could preserve the truth of who his mother was, what she meant to their family, and what had really happened during these dark days. Someday, when he was older and stronger, he would find a way to bring her home. The castle around him continued its stately rhythms, but George now understood that beneath the formal protocols and ancient traditions, very human dramas of power and manipulation were being played out. His childhood innocence was gone forever, stripped away not by natural growth but by the calculated cruelty of adults who should have protected him. In his room that night, George wrote a letter to his mother that he knew he couldn't send. In it, he promised her that he would never forget the truth, never stop loving her, never stop fighting for their family to be whole again. It was a promise that would shape the rest of his young life, turning a grieving child into something more dangerous to those who had wronged his family, a future king who understood exactly how power could be misused and who was determined never to let it happen again. 2 weeks had passed since George learned the truth about his mother's forced departure, and the young prince had become a different person entirely. Where once there had been easy laughter and childish joy, now there was a watchful gravity that seemed far too mature for his 10 years. He had learned to navigate the increasingly tense atmosphere of the castle with careful diplomacy, showing Camilla the deference she expected while privately documenting every cruel word and manipulative gesture. The morning sun filtered through the breakfast room windows as George took his customary seat, now always directly across from Camilla. William had stopped joining them for breakfast altogether, claiming urgent business that required his attention before dawn. George suspected his father was simply avoiding the uncomfortable dynamic that had developed between his son and stepmother. "You seem very thoughtful lately, George," Camilla observed, stirring her tea with deliberate precision. "I hope you're beginning to understand that change, while difficult, often leads to better circumstances." George looked up from his porridge, his young face carefully neutral. "I've been thinking about responsibility," he said quietly. "About what it means to protect the people you're supposed to care about." Something in his tone made Camilla pause, her spoon suspended halfway to her lips. There was an undercurrent to the boy's words that she couldn't quite identify, but it made her uneasy. "That's very mature of you," she said carefully. "Responsibility is indeed the cornerstone of royal duty. Sometimes that means making difficult choices, even when they hurt the people we love." "Like sending mothers away from their children?" George asked, his voice still quiet but carrying an edge that made Camilla stiffen. "George," Camilla's voice took on a warning tone, "we've discussed this. Your mother made her own choices. No one forced her to do anything." For the first time since learning the truth, George allowed some of his real feelings to show in his expression. "But that's not true, is it? You gave her an ultimatum. Comply or face consequences that would hurt all of us. That's not really a choice at all." The color drained from Camilla's face. The boy wasn't supposed to know these details, wasn't supposed to understand the sophisticated political maneuvering that had led to Kate's exile. The fact that he did know suggested that her control over the situation wasn't as complete as she had believed. "Who told you that?" she demanded, her carefully maintained composure slipping for the first time. "Who have you been talking to?" George met her gaze steadily. "Does it matter?" "The truth is the truth, regardless of where it comes from." The simple dignity in his response infuriated Camilla more than any childish outburst could have. This was not the grieving, confused child she had expected to mold to her will. This was someone who understood exactly what had been done to his family and who was not going to quietly accept it. "You're 10 years old," Camilla snapped, her mask slipping further. You don't understand the complexities of adult relationships, the demands of royal life, the sacrifices that must be made for the greater good. I understand that you broke up my family because you didn't like sharing influence, George replied, his voice growing stronger. I understand that you convinced my father that my mother was unfit when the only thing unfit about her was that she wouldn't let you control her. Camilla stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor with a harsh sound that echoed in the suddenly silent room. How dare you speak to me that way? I am your queen consort. I deserve your respect. Respect is earned, George said, words that sounded strange coming from such a young voice but carried the weight of absolute conviction. And you haven't earned mine. For a moment, the two stared at each other across the breakfast table, the ornate room bearing witness to a confrontation that would define their relationship for years to come. Camilla saw in George's eyes the same stubborn determination that had made Kate so difficult to control, the same moral clarity that had made her such a threat to Camilla's carefully laid plans. Your defiance won't bring her back, Camilla said finally, her voice cold with suppressed rage. Your mother is gone, George. The sooner you accept that reality, the easier your life will be. My mother is at her parents' house in Berkshire, George replied calmly. She's not gone. She's just being kept away by people who think power is more important than love. The specific knowledge of Kate's location clearly shocked Camilla. Her network of informants had assured her that George had been kept isolated from any real information about his mother's situation. The fact that he knew where Kate was staying suggested that her control over the flow of information was far from complete. You think you're very clever, don't you? Camilla said, her voice taking on a dangerous quality. But, you're still just a child, George. A child who can be sent away to school, isolated from harmful influences, taught proper respect for authority. The threat was delivered with silky smoothness, but its implications were crystal clear. George felt a chill run through him as he realized that his newfound knowledge made him dangerous to Camilla's plans, and dangerous people in her world had a tendency to be removed from the equation. You can't just make me disappear, George said, though his voice betrayed a tremor of uncertainty. People would ask questions. Of course not, Camilla smiled, but there was no warmth in it. But there are many excellent boarding schools that would be delighted to provide the future king with a properly structured education. Schools where visiting privileges are strictly limited and communication with the outside world is carefully monitored for the student's own protection. The sophisticated cruelty of the threat took George's breath away. She wasn't talking about physical harm, but about a different kind of disappearance, one that would separate him from any possibility of contact with his mother while appearing to serve his best interests. My father would never agree to that, George said, but even as he spoke the words, he could hear the doubt in his own voice. Your father is under enormous stress right now, Camilla replied, settling back into her chair with predatory satisfaction. He's questioning his judgment about many things, including what's best for his children. It wouldn't be difficult to convince him that you need the stability and discipline that only a proper boarding school can provide. George realized with growing horror that she was probably right. William's confidence had been systematically undermined along with Kate's position. The man who had once been so certain about his family's priorities now seemed to doubt every decision he made. It would be all too easy for Camilla to present George's recent behavioral problems as evidence that he needed more structure and authority in his life. Why are you doing this? George asked, abandoning any pretense of diplomatic courtesy. Why do you hate us so much? For just a moment, Camilla's carefully constructed facade cracked completely, revealing something raw and desperate underneath. I don't hate you, George. But I will not be displaced again. I will not watch another woman waltz into this family and be handed everything I had to fight decades to achieve. The admission revealed more than Camilla had intended. This wasn't really about Kate's fitness for royal duty or George's proper education. This was about a woman who had spent decades as the other woman, always in the shadows, finally achieving the position she had always craved, only to find herself potentially overshadowed by a younger, more popular daughter-in-law. My mother never tried to displace you, George said quietly. She never wanted your position. She just wanted to be a good wife and mother. Your mother was a threat to everything I've worked for, Camilla snapped, her composure completely gone now. Do you think I spent 40 years waiting, fighting, being vilified in the press, just to watch some commoner's daughter become the real power behind the throne? Your mother had Charles's ear, William's devotion, and the people's love. What exactly was I supposed to be left with? The naked jealousy and ambition in her voice horrified George more than any threat could have. This woman, who had positioned herself as the guardian of royal tradition and duty, was revealed as someone driven by the pettiest of human emotions. She hadn't destroyed his family for any noble purpose, she had done it to satisfy her own desperate need for relevance and control. "You could have been part of our family," George said, his young voice heavy with sadness. "Mummy always tried to include you, always showed you respect. You could have been my grandmother in truth instead of just in title." The words hit Camilla like physical blows. In her single-minded focus on eliminating what she saw as threats to her position, she had destroyed any possibility of the genuine family relationships she secretly craved. Her paranoia and ambition had created the very isolation she had fought so hard to avoid. For a moment, something like regret flickered across her features. But it was quickly replaced by a hardening resolve. She had come too far, sacrificed too much, to turn back now. "It's too late for sentiment, George. Your mother made her choice, and now you must make yours. Accept the new reality and find your place in it, or continue to fight battles you cannot win and face consequences you will not enjoy." George stood slowly, his young body carrying itself with a dignity that made him seem older than his years. "I've already made my choice," he said quietly. "I choose truth over convenience, love over power, and family over politics. And someday, when I'm older and stronger, I'll make sure everyone knows what you really did to us." The promise was delivered without drama or childish bravado, which made it all the more chilling. Camilla found herself looking at a 10-year-old boy and seeing the future king he would become, a king who would remember exactly how he had been treated and who had betrayed his family when he was powerless to stop it. "That's a dangerous game you're choosing to play, George," she said softly. "I'm not playing a game," George replied. "I'm making a commitment. And, unlike some people in this family, when I make a commitment, I keep it." He walked out of the breakfast room with measured steps, leaving Camilla alone with the realization that her victory over Kate might have come at a price she hadn't anticipated. She had eliminated one threat to her position, but, in doing so, she might have created an even more dangerous enemy. George was no longer the malleable child she had planned to influence. He was becoming something much more formidable, a future king who understood exactly how power could be abused and who would spend the rest of his life ensuring that such abuses never happened again on his watch. The battle for control of the royal family's future had entered a new phase, and, for the first time since beginning her campaign against Kate, Camilla wondered if her ultimate victory might actually be a defeat in disguise. The autumn rain pelted against the windows of Kate's childhood bedroom at her parents' house in Berkshire, each drop seeming to echo the tears she had cried over the past month. She sat at her old desk, the same one where she had done homework as a teenager, now writing letters to her children that she knew she couldn't send. The legal restrictions that governed her separation from the royal family were explicit: no unsupervised contact, no unauthorized communication, no attempts to undermine the stability that had been established for the children. Kate's mother, Carol Middleton, knocked softly before entering the room.